This was our first experience with 5-chloro-alpha-methyltryptamine, hereafter in this report referred to as 5-CL-AMT, and we decided to start with 10 mg, which seemed like a probably low dosage since this is such a newly available molecule with so little written about it, just to be safe. We unfortunately do not have experience with either AMT or 5-MeU-AMT and will not be able to draw comparisons to them, which is another reason we'd like to be extra cautious about this one too, since we really don't have much idea what to expect for ourselves. We can of course compare to the psychedelics we usually discuss, and part of the reason we were interested in it was to explore its potential empathogen and stimulant effects too, as while we haven't used drugs like this actively or almost at all in many years, we did once go through a phase of using MDMA quite frequently and amphetamine and other stimulants we could get our hands on infrequently, and were curious to have a new experience of that kind again after so long that also still remained within the family of psychedelic tryptamines we've also gotten so much out of. Our previous experience with psychedelics included DMT, MET, MPT, EPT, DPT, MEPT, DPT, MALT, DALT, psilocybe cubensis, 4-HO-MET, 4-HO-DET, 4-HO-MPT, 4-HO-EPT, 4-HO-DPT, 4-HO-MEPT, 4-HO-DPT, 4-HO-MCPT, 4-ACO-DMT, 4-ACO-MET, 4-ACO-DET, 4-ACO-MALT, 4-ACO-DALT, 5-HO-DMT, 5-MeU-MEPT, 5-MeU-APT, 5-MeU-DPT, 5-MeU-DALT, Ipomoea tricolor, Argyrian nervosa, LSD, ETH-LAD, AL-LAD, 1P-LSD, 2CC, 2CB, 2CI, 2CE, 2CP, DOOF, DOC, DOB, TMA2, 4CD, BOD, myristica fragrans, and MDMA. Our most recent trip before this was on tilde 5 mg of 5-MeU-MEPT smoked a couple mornings before this, earlier than we started this one. We were initially willing to place this trial so shortly after that experience because we didn't expect that the 5-CL-AMT would really show psychedelic effects at this dosage, and therefore we wouldn't likely have to worry about tolerance interfering with the experience or anything, but in retrospect that expectation ended up seeming somewhat premature, and in the future we intend to space it out after the most recent psychedelic trip before it in the way that we most often do. There are just a few more points that should be covered quickly before beginning the actual reporting. First, we just recently went through a couple-month period of smoking a lot of different psychedelic tryptamines up to a few times a week in increasingly large dosages, climaxing in an extremely powerful multi-day experience that has taken weeks to full recovery relative normalcy from, and it's been just a little bit over a month and a half since the last trip in that total experience happened now, so we've come a long way but are still feeling freshly affected by the experience in various ways. One of which seems to be that it's been extremely easy for us to go further out than we used to on smaller dosages of psychedelics we've taken since to test the waters than it used to be, which seems relevant to mention based on psychedelic effects that we did end up noting here and will describe further down. On top of this, we and I in particular, theta, seem to have a relatively higher sensitivity to getting notable psychedelic effects in general from both 5-substituted tryptamines and base tryptamines more so than other types of psychedelics, and while the chlorine substitution is unique to us, 5-CL-AMT is still a 5-substituted tryptamine, and at the same time halogen substitutions are supposed to act a bit more like hydrogens in some ways too, which seems like it could also make 5-CL-AMT more similar to AMT than to, say, 5-MeU-AMT in some ways, for instance, so it seems worth considering that even if we weren't in a seemingly more heightened state of psychedelic sensitivity right now, I might be able to detect psychedelic effects in a molecule like this more easily than some. Finally, because we had smoked 5-MeU-MEPT a couple days before this, not initially anticipating much psychedelic overlap, and given that the psychedelia of 5-methoxytryptamines seem to linger for us longer than most other tryptamine psychedelics, it's possible that it left an imprint on this experience as well, but I'll say that the 5-MeU-MEPT experience was a subtle one and there was no signs lingering psychedelia aside from a nice afterglow the day before this. Alright, so anyway, the day came when we decided we were going to do our first experiment with 5-CL-AMT. The significance of this day was that we've just recently moved out of our apartment and are staying with our parents through the holidays, hopefully, at least, the plan basically being to be able to take some time to regroup and ride out some of the pandemic without having to continue to pay our own bills since we quit our extremely socially interactive job and figure out what our plan for the nearly immediate future is now, which is a nice opportunity for us all things considered, but at the same time it means we're near constantly at the house with our parents who are also at the house near constantly due to social distancing, and we just weren't really feeling the idea of trying a brand new psychedelic and pathogen stimulant that lasts possibly the entire day and that both users so far note as good for being horny with literally nothing to do all day but hang out with our parents and not even any way to escape that environment if desired. But on this day they had made a nowadays incredibly rare plan to be out for the entire day, and it just seemed like the perfect chance. Initially, we thought a friend we obviously rarely get to see anymore might have been able to come over and sit for us. He wasn't interested in taking anything himself, too, but he unfortunately had to cancel at the last second, so it became a solo journey, and we dosed just a little under an hour before our parents were leaving, expecting it to really start hitting right around the time they finally left. T+0. 10 mg of 5-cl AMT taken orally with water. I don't remember the taste being very good, but we've gotten pretty good at getting these things down while barely tasting them at all, so I didn't really notice or think too much about it. Based on the close structural relation to AMT, we expected it to take a while, again probably at least around an hour before we really started feeling much, though by the time it was around T+10 minutes or T+15 minutes, we definitely suddenly really had to poop, which is significant for us in this case. Zirkoth mentions in his first 5-cl AMT report that he got a stimulant shit feeling within the first half an hour where he needed to poop, similar to what he gets on other stimulants while coming up, but that's not something we can recall getting from stimulants ourselves, while on the other hand we actually do pretty consistently get a similar effect while coming up on psychedelic tryptamines, and when it happens, it's usually within the first 10 or 15 minutes like this, and it feels just like this felt when the sensations increases so rapidly. At the time, we wondered if perhaps the effect was just a placebo from the similar taste the 5-cl AMT had to other tryptamines, or something like that, but in retrospect I would feel a lot more confident suggesting that it was most likely just directly producing the same sort of effect that other tryptamines do for us in this way. We made a note about being out of the bathroom at T+23 minutes, and after that noted some slight rushing sensations beginning as well as what seemed to be a little bit of music appreciation enhancement developing, along with a stomach discomfort that in the moment at least reminded us somewhat of the feeling we would sometimes get when coming up on MDMA, or at least as we recall that feeling, though it's been many years, but we noted no significant change in energy level or heart rate during this time. Finally, our parents left shortly before the next timestamp, and we shifted gears to being more completely into the experience. T+55 minutes. We took our first hit of cannabis at this point, wanting to really bring the high out, which for the record we do not only for psychedelics as often reported, but even for things like MDMA and amphetamine, excitedly hoping to see more of what the drug can do, and also being somewhat concerned that if we didn't try to milk it out a little it would never really be all that powerful on its own, just since we were purposefully testing a lower dosage for our first time. I began sending some online messages to friends, which is where a lot of the detail of this trip report comes from, since I said most of what I needed to say to remember it in there rather than taking regular notes. At T+1 hour and 1 minute, I noted that the amount of fine visual detail I seemed to be taking in had dramatically increased, which I still remember quite clearly. We were watching the music video for Out the Window by Confidence Man, and I suddenly noticed that I was perceiving every part of the patterns on the screen at once and noticing all the minor details of the skin and lips of the artists when they were on the screen, which did immediately remind me of things like MDMA and amphetamine in a way that I had long since forgotten, and I was quite happy about it. I tell a friend that it feels quite good, though I may be biased by the fact that this is the only thing like this we've done in many years, but it sure doesn't feel like a bias in the moment. At T+1 hour and 4 minutes, I note that the euphoria and central stimulation are definitely picking up, but there's no physical stimulation that I can detect so far still. T plus 1 hour and 7 minutes. This is the first point at which I felt I could start detecting a slight trippiness to the state I was in, but I was initially hesitant to think that it might be much more than a combination of us having a dissociative disorder and being high and several different recreational mechanisms of action at once, including the increasingly strong cannabis high. Nonetheless, as it continued to develop a little bit further, it became more recognizable, and in a curious way. Specifically, as the next song began playing, though we didn't note what it was and I've forgotten now, I started seeing a very faint vision in my mind's eye, almost entirely dark and shadow, yet with some very brightly colored and colorful neon outlines to either movement within the scene, like tracers or auras, or focus on a certain part of it, that being that it was at least one person, maybe multiple but at least one, playing musical instruments, and as they played a note, something like the key on the keyboard or string on the guitar would light up more completely in the neon colors, though just one solid color per instance. What seems so interesting and notable about this to me, aside from it just being fun to watch, is that literally the only thing I can recall that I can actually compare it to is the kinds of mind's eye visions I've also gotten while coming up on 4CD, at least once literally almost identically, which greatly intrigues me both then and now, given that 4CD is another weird, sort of in-between sort of hybrid, both psychedelic-like and empathogen-like molecule according to the anecdotes so far including our own, and that thought did make me excited to think that this 5-CL-AMT might have some more obvious psychedelic effects after all, but at the same I wasn't sure if I should think that maybe instead this type of mind's eye vision was just a kind of trippiness I get these days from empathogens instead, so I tried to still reserve judgment about any true psychedelic effects just yet. T plus 1 hour and 10 minutes. I note we've been bobbing our head to the music, it feels like it could snap off, yet we're still just sitting on the couch doing it because that's how much more central than peripheral stimulation there is. I'm really liking it so far, and think that it does feel amazingly similar to both MDMA and amphetamine without the adrenaline rush feeling of either overall, regardless of whether or not that's set by my expectations. At this point I do think it feels more like MDMA than like amphetamine, but the character more like the latter is still clear too, especially with things like the aforementioned increase in the amount of visual detail I was taking in. I also note that I like the way the cannabis feeling blends with the coming up feeling of the 5-CL-AMT, in a way that reminds me of how cannabis blends well, in my opinion, with coming up on MDMA, though I also relate this to how cannabis blends with serotonergic drugs in general, like psychedelics. At T plus 1 hour and 14 minutes, we also noted that we found clubby much more appealing than chill, trippy music at this point despite the lack of push. T plus 1 hour and 23 minutes. I'm finding the fact that Zerkoth reduced around this time both times he's taken 5-CL-AMT so far a lot easier to understand at this point, as my own desire to bump the high up further now is already becoming quite strong too. It still feels nice, but I feel like the initial rush is starting to pass a bit, and it's still leveling out into something that will clearly last for some time, but we're still a little nervous that it's going to be a little too low to really make it worth using up our special rare day alone at the house for. We began debating it internally, however at that moment the power in the house went out for a moment and came back on with the internet refusing to work, putting us in the very annoying situation of still really just coming up on a psychedelic empathogen stimulant drug alone at a house with basically nothing to do and no way to easily communicate with others throughout it outside of texting, so we focused all of our attention on that, trying to see if we could manage to find an internet connection again or if there was something going on with the service or whatever. Luckily, at about T plus 1 hour and 44 minutes, it started working again, and we were still kind of on the fence about adding more to our dose, but had a feeling if we just waited it out it would probably be satisfying enough. T plus 1 hour and 47 minutes. We realized we felt kind of like we were hungry and knew we hadn't eaten anything big that day yet, and we questioned whether trying to eat something would be a good idea in any way right now while in the beginning phase of a drug with pharmacological overlaps with empathogens and stimulants, but we reasoned that we were smoking cannabis too and had eaten plenty on things like MDMA and amphetamine after smoking lots of cannabis too, so we figured we'd probably be fine. We grabbed some peanuts and peanut butter snack bar out of the kitchen pantry and took a big bite out of it, and immediately realized how very much we wished to not be attempting to eat anything at that moment, just unpleasantly sloshing it around in our mouth, feeling and tasting all the unappealing textures and flavors, and then forced ourselves to painfully swallow it so that we would at least have a little more of something in our stomach now. Obviously we should have just trusted our gut, but maybe it's just been too long since we took those kinds of drugs otherwise and need to build up our resilience to the anorectic effect again. At T+1 hour and 50 minutes, we started chewing some tasty cold grape flavored gum instead, and then put on Ecstasy by ATB now that the internet was back on, because it felt like the thing to do as soon as we started chewing that gum. At T+2 hours, the hunger that plagued us before was still present despite food seeming unappetizing, so rather than going with another nutty snack bar, we tried eating a blackberry and a couple blueberries, followed by a horrible wave of nasty bitterness spreading throughout our mouth and going down our throat. Food clearly just wasn't going to be an option for the moment, as hungry as we were. T+2 hours and 7 minutes. At this point we noted that the experience seemed to be somewhat switching gears on us now, with the central energy from the beginning largely slipping away and being replaced by something more totally calm and more MDMA-like than amphetamine-like in our estimation. Surkoth did say something after his second experience with 5-CL-AMT about the experience seemingly becoming more serotonergic as more time went by, but I don't think he was saying it happened quite this early for him, but he also reduced around this time. As this apparent shift continued to develop, we became confident in our decision to not redose ourselves and didn't think about doing so again after this point, as we were starting to enjoy just chilling on the couch and now starting to listen to trancier music again after all. Omicron, who seems like she may like MDMA the most of any of us in here, also became notably more excited about the effects starting around this time, and she did come out and enjoy them from time to time as we're used to her doing with MDMA, and I'm not sure if that's included much in the notes I wrote because I was kind of focusing more on other aspects of the experience myself, but I did just want to put it out there at least. She's pretty much our best judge of MDMA-like effects and is one of our alters who particularly enjoyed finding that kind of effect by her estimation in 4CD2, so it seems notable to us that she also enjoyed the 5-CL-AMT-induced state so much in a similar way. T+2 hours and 34 minutes. Up until now I hadn't been sure, but at this point I'm confident. I can feel the psychedelic effect of the 5-CL-AMT beginning to show itself a bit more clearly. It's still a quite light psychedelic effect, and we've been smoking cannabis pretty frequently, but I've seen those kinds of effects now to know them when I see them. Most significantly, the music has started to bring out faint, clearly tryptamine-styled psychedelic mind's eye imagery, notably distinct from the more 4CD-like imagery that appeared before. The first thing I actually recall seeing was several sort of mask-like faces lined up in rows extending back into the distance, but also from a slightly lifted perspective, so only so many rows were clearly visible, and this sort of mask-like imagery is something I've seen on many indole psychedelics, both tryptamine and lysergamide, so it really wasn't surprising in that way, and I'd say the organization of the faces in the particular image that first appeared reminded me more of Allied than anything. But fascinatingly, something that sets base tryptamines apart from other indoles and psychedelics in general for me is that when these sorts of mask-like faces appear, they tend to seem more alive and animated in comparison to how they seem more like still images on the others at an otherwise similar level of intensity. Yet 5-CL-AMT's presentation of this effect also had them seeming more alive and animated than the others usually do for me, with what I felt to be a sort of goblin-like demeanor that specifically reminded me of DBT, which had this effect even stronger than several other base tryptamines for me so far, while at the same time, the color scheme and texture of this image was specifically distinct from DPT and other base tryptamines for me, yet highly similar to those of both 5-MeO-MePT and 5-MeO-DPT for me, involving some very deep and vivid but translucent reds bathing an otherwise quite gray, sometimes almost purple but mostly dark and shadowy but fluid image at this level, and this immediately struck me as a fascinating piece of potential evidence that 5-CL-AMT could even subjectively as a psychedelic act somewhat in between the subjective effects of both more standard 5-substituted tryptamines like the 5-methoxytryptamines and the base tryptamines for the reason I briefly covered at the beginning of the report, basically the halogen potentially acting as a somewhat more benign substitution, but of course future experiences will certainly have to dig much deeper into this and I look forward to them doing so. The fact that the visuals did seem to have some similarity to those I get from 5-MeO-MePT is also part of why I wanted to make the point about having smoked it a couple mornings prior at the beginning of this report, but this all now being said, we just a couple months before this also smoked 5 mg of 5-MeO-MePT followed by smoking 30 mg of MET 2 days later, exactly like this except switch out the 5-CL-AMT for the MET, and the MET showed no apparent signs of milking any leftover psychedelic effects visually or otherwise from the 5-MeO-MePT and in fact seemed to be reduced in effect, the MET, due to tolerance. So honestly, as much as the potential exists that smoking 5-MeO-MePT a couple days before this may have colored the experience, I think it may be even more possible that the main thing it did was actually produce tolerance to the 5-CL-AMT's psychedelic component that might have been even stronger for me otherwise, so I'm just putting that out there for now, and again next time we'll put more time between the previous trip and our next trial with this one. In any case, getting back to the visual I described above, at first it began with the rows of faces as I described, but those faces then all rapidly twisting into a spiral in a very fluid manner that almost looked like they were a single body of liquid smoothly flowing down into a drain, but instead of disappearing they pulled into a center that immediately exploded out as countless entity arms all reaching out in different directions in a way that's again a pretty standard psychedelic and especially tryptamine visual for me, and I've often compared it to the many-armed depictions of Avalokitesvara, and while this entire image was relatively faint, this part of it was notably three-dimensional in a way comparable to what I would consider some of the deeper and more classical psychedelics like LSD, mushrooms, and DOB have done for me. I believe this was the end of that particular mental image, and I don't believe I actually continued to note when others happened, though they did, so I'll just say I don't think the phase of mental imagery that clear coming and going lasted for more than probably an hour at least mostly, and the images were very fleeting and far between in that time, but I do recall feeling like there were minor hints of that same headspace trailing for a lot of the remainder of the experience. I unfortunately don't recall the specific imagery that occurred that I didn't attempt to note now either, but I do remember one was a quick flash of someone who I recognized just standing with some vague scene behind him, and again the way the scene was arranged reminded me more of the sort of realistic imagery based tryptamines have produced for me while having color schemes and textures more like 5-methoxytryptamines, so again I thought it was promising and it made me quite excited to push further into that effect, though cautiously of course. T+2 hours and 41 minutes. At this point, I began to question the idea that this was a particularly dopaminergic high transitioning to feeling like a more primarily serotonergic empathogen, as to me it was actually starting to feel a lot more like the way that psychedelics can be stimulating as they're coming on but become heavier and more trancy as the initial rush and anxiety pass and they approach peak psychedelic effects, especially if they're a dreamier kind like tryptamines often are for us. I do think it's very much worth considering that even though the reports so on 5-CL-AMT we've seen so far have emphasized the monoamine releasing agent-like effects, the scientific data we've seen suggests that its most potent site of action is still 5-HT2A receptor agonism, so I don't think it's wild to think that if it showed any effects at all, those effects could include psychedelic ones, but at the same time, I think it's also worth considering that the 5-halogenated DMT analogs don't seem to be particularly powerful psychedelics as of yet, and even in the realm of 5-methoxytryptamines, which I personally get plenty powerful psychedelic effects from, many describe them as relatively lacking in this way and often primarily describe them as producing stimulant-like and empathogen-like effects. Nonetheless, with the amount of similarities I have already felt were notably present to both MDMA and amphetamine than I had detected in other psychedelics, I remained willing to believe that the monoamine releasing action was already meaningful at this level, but definitely still think that a lot of the transitioning in effects, at least that we noticed in our own experience, might have just been the psychedelic effects going through the normal phases they go through for us, and this is the point at which the fact that we needed to poop shortly after dosing comparable to when we take other psychedelic tryptamines started to stand out more vividly in retrospect too. T+2 hours and 45 minutes. At this point I noted that eating was becoming easier again, and I'm pretty sure what we did is just finish that peanuts and peanut butter snack bar that was just sitting there unfinished since earlier. I don't believe it was particularly appetizing at this point still, but we were able to enjoy the fact that we were getting something more into our stomach again. T+2 hours and 55 minutes. Actually, based on the notes, I'm pretty sure this is where some of the heaviest mental imagery occurred. Again though, I didn't actually write down what specifically happened here. We continued listening to music and thinking about life, but nothing that seemed worth noting happened other than the aforementioned mild but notable psychedelic effects that we were continuing to enjoy during this time period. Finally, feeling that we wanted to relax a bit more rather than just aimlessly wandering around the house, at T+3 hours and 32 minutes, we decided to take a hot bath, taking a fresh bowl of cannabis in there with us. The bath was quite enjoyable and we spent it listening to music and thinking, but I don't remember anything particularly noteworthy occurring in that time. T+4 hours and 9 minutes. I sent a text to a friend saying that it feels like it's getting to a point where it feels like it may not change too much from this point, but that I've been wrong before. At this point I felt that it had been an interesting and insightful experience so far, honestly more so than it had been fun, not that it hadn't been fun. I sort of just felt like the MDMA-like effects were present enough to make me feel altered, but the state in general wasn't enough to make me feel completely high at all times, and it made it sort of came off with that weird roll feeling at times where sometimes you just feel heavy and warmer, but it was never overbearing in that way, and I never got the impression that the problem was anything other than just that a higher dosage of this needs to be taken for me to find my ideal comfort with it, to get enough push to really fully activate and balance out that feeling. T+5 hours and 19 minutes. I did notice light sexual stimulation at this point that was brought out by music, but I ruined it by letting the YouTube related videos transition to the soundtrack from Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, starting with Let's Duet with Jenna Fisher, but that did still make for some good laughs. T+7 hours and 27 minutes. I sent another message to a friend saying we were clearly past the chattier part of it now, as we were no longer sending regular messages, which is part of why there are so few details about this part of the experience, and that we had recently finally had our first meal during the experience, which was fish and chips, something we researched extensively to make sure it should be okay even if on a potentially effective dosage of a MAOI, though only remembered to do so after already ordering it. Up until then we had started to feel a bit physically off, but suspected that hunger might be the culprit, as it certainly didn't seem like anything more serious than that, and after eating the meal we did feel much better and more balanced out again. I go on to say to my friend that it does feel like a stimulant and an empathogen and a psychedelic to me, which is cool, and it reminds me of MDMA, though I also think it's fairly distinct from MDMA at the same time, and I so far suspect that psychedelic effects may be the most prominent effects of 5-CL-AMT for me at a higher dosage. At T+7.5 hours. I add that the body feeling we have at that time is really nice, and nicer than just a standard psychedelic body high, I think, though as the entire experience has been at this point it's still not too powerful. There are no more notes or messages for me to draw from for the rest of the night before we fell asleep on the couch, but I do recall that spent a lot of it increasingly not thinking but just listening to the amazingly enhanced music while lying down on said couch, hearing it sound so deep it was almost like it had an echo in a way that distinctly reminded us of MDMA and that we had not experienced in a long time, and we very much enjoyed the nostalgia. Because Zirkov had already by this point in our experience reported his increase in serotonergic effects throughout the later hours of the experience, we continued to pay attention for that kind of thing ourselves in the later hours, and we were definitely up just enjoying this high on our own at least past 12 or 13 hours past dosing, and perhaps more, though I can't recall that clearly anymore, and it definitely remained a good high that felt like it had what we suspect to be a serotonergic component like that, but it didn't feel like it continued to increase in intensity beyond the earlier hours and never became uncomfortable, as he reported. We were just physically blissful until we finally became tired and content enough to pass out. I will say that in the later hours there was a component of the high that felt a bit different from the earlier hours on top of this, but I felt it to be highly similar to the same sort of effect we get from base tryptamines and 5-methoxytryptamines pretty consistently, specifically that even after the initial wave of heavier psychedelic effects wears off, there remains a lingering trippy euphoric state that seems to eventually sort of just transition into what people call the afterglow, and we definitely did feel like that in combination with the lingering MDMA-like feeling was pretty great. T plus 17 hours and 22 minutes. We woke up in the middle of the night, technically early the next morning, went to the bathroom, loaded another bowl of cannabis, and then moved into our bedroom to smoke and hopefully bring back the trip and high a bit more, the body still feeling quite good and relaxed, as we fall back asleep again. This marked the end of our note-taking, and essentially the end of our experience. I intended to write this trip report quickly but got a bit lazy about it, so we decided to take the opportunity to try to pay closer attention to the after effects too. For what it's worth, depression in the days following MDMA was never a significant problem of ours that we can recall having, but we were already pretty depressed in general during that time of our life. Our life isn't perfect now, but we are actually much better off now than we were back then, and for what it's worth we were not able to detect any apparent increase in depressive symptoms in the now exactly 1 full week following our experience. On the other hand, something I would like to note is that we seem to be particularly sensitive to certain more addictive types of drugs, bringing out more of our addictive thinking in general after the experience, and we've recently realized that this sort of effect is actually one that is not uncommon for us to get after using psychedelic phenethylamines as well, and while we often find psychedelic tryptamines to in contrast seemingly decrease our addictive thinking after the experience, after this 5-CL-AMT experience we did actually come to the conclusion that we felt a bit more like we have after phenethylamine trips in this way than we usually do after tryptamines trips on average. We can only guess might be related to its stimulant effects, but whatever the reason, it was enough for us to note it to take into consideration for after future uses of 5-CL-AMT, though not enough to discourage us from using it in the same way we're not discouraged from using phenethylamine psychedelics. I will note that 5 days after this experience we smoked 5 mg of 5-MeU-DPT and had a very positive experience, and after that the increase in cravings and such we felt after the 5-CL-AMT once again reverted, as they often do following tryptamine trips for us, and we've thought before that closely timing different types of trips like this may be part of how we balance out some of these lingering effects in ourselves in the future, which this experience added to. I think that's about all we have to say about 5-CL-AMT for now, but we look forward to experimenting with it again, but not without great caution, especially considering Zirkov's unsettling second time with it, though he proposes the reason that might have happened, gabapentin withdrawals, which we do not have and we didn't notice anything unsettling so far, but of course it's such a newly released drug with potentially dangerous mechanisms of action that it should be used with great caution regardless. It's certainly a very complex substance and I could see people having some very different reactions to and opinions about it, and I definitely think it could have the potential to produce some good, but certainly hopefully with those who are using it respecting it in the process.